The challenges and opportunities of carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Interview with Professor Paul Fennell. Hello, listener, and welcome back to our podcast, Climate Law Matters, in which we explore the legal developments across different sectors to address the key issue of climate change. I'm Celia Reynolds, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers, specialising in environmental and climate change cases. The focus of today's podcast is carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and I'm very excited to be joined by Professor Paul Fennell, a Professor of Clean Energy at the Department of Chemical Engineering, Imperial College London. His work encompasses the decarbonization and rethinking of industrial processes, including the production of iron and steel and cement manufacture. He also works in the broader field of industrial decarbonisation, including synergies between industry and power generation. Paul, thank you for joining us today. To start with, could you please tell the listener about your background and expertise in this area?
So I've been working in carbon capture and storage for, sadly, I recently worked out was something about 20 years. I did a PhD in Cambridge 20 odd years ago, looking at different ways to actually burn coal. Back in those days, we were more concerned about running out of energy, and coal looked like it was a great thing to be working in. But climate change kind of reared its ugly head, and I realised that I needed to change to something a bit more environmentally sensitive. So I've been working in carbon capture and storage in various types, mainly advanced types of carbon capture and storage, so lower energy cost carbon capture and storage for a while. And more recently, I've moved into carbon capture and storage on industrial processes rather than power, because there's lots of people who've been working on power, and I needed to do something that was a bit different to everybody else.
Brilliant. And so if we could start with the basics first, what is carbon capture?
So carbon capture is where you take CO2 from, let's start out by saying from the exhaust of a power station, where it might be between 3 and 15%, and you capture it using frequently something like an amine, a solvent, which sucks the CO2 into it. And then you take that solvent off to a different reactor and you heat it up, and the CO2 comes off at nearly 100%. And then you compress that CO2 to high pressure, which is about 100 bar, and then you pipeline transport it somewhere, and then you inject it a couple of kilometers under the ground in a location that's been surveyed to make sure that it's safe and the CO2 that you're sticking down there will actually stay down there.
Okay, and what types of locations are we talking about?
So there's two types that are mainly thought about. You've got saline aquifers, which are areas underground, volumes underground, where there is essentially salty water in the pores of rocks. So it's not a great big void that you're sticking CO2 into. You're putting CO2 down into the pores of rocks, and then above the area that you're injecting into, there's something called a cap rock, which is a thick geological deposit which prevents the CO2 from coming back up. So you've got this cap rock above a saline aquifer. The other place where you could store CO2 is in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, or actually in oil production, although obviously if you're putting CO2 down to produce more oil, that's got its own issues. But you've got essentially places where there was oil and gas being produced, and there is space down there for you to put CO2 back down there. And again, you have to have a cap rock above them. That's actually the reason why the oil or gas was stored there in the first place, because you've got this geological seal above the place where the CO2 is going, or where the oil and gas had been for, billions of years.
So what you've described, as I understand it, is a sort of point of source carbon capture. And there's been a lot of conversations recently also about the concept of direct air capture storage. Could you explain for the listener the difference?
Right. So point source carbon capture is where you've got CO2 at maybe 5 to 15%, maybe 30% in the case of a cement plant. An air capture process just basically is designed to capture CO2 directly from the air. The trouble with that is that CO2 is currently 400 and whatever parts per million, and let's hope that it doesn't go up too much more than that, but 400 parts per million rather than between 3 and 30%. So it's capturing CO2 from a very, very dilute source. Right? It's not so dilute that it's not doing potential damage to humanity and to the world, but it's not concentrated enough that it's easy to capture the CO2 from it. So essentially the process would be just pass a whacking great amount of air through a capture unit, similar to the one that you would have on a plant, on an industrial plant. And again, capture the CO2 using a solvent or a sorbent or something like that. So a solvent is a liquid and a sorbent is a solid. And then change the conditions and take the CO2 off at 100%. But, and I won't go into thermodynamics because I'm sure that much as the finer points of European law are not something that I would like to discuss, it is monstrously more expensive in terms of energy to capture the CO2 from the air as opposed to capturing it from industry, from a concentrated source.
And so you've mentioned here one of the key challenges, or the first challenge in this podcast of carbon capture and storage is the cost. How does the cost of direct air capture compare to point of source carbon capture?
Well, it depends where you're capturing the CO2 from. So if you are capturing the CO2 from something like let's say, a natural gas processing system where the CO2 might be available at 100% and 30 atmospheres, the CO2 capture is actually very, very inexpensive. So you might be producing it and able to take it away for storage for maybe $20 per ton of CO2. If you're doing it on a standard power station, I would think you would be able to do it for maybe $100 to $120 per ton of CO2. And if you're trying to do it on air, then $500, $600 per ton. So it's significantly more expensive because just to get at CO2 at those low levels of dilution, you have to pass vast amounts of air through your system. Overall, it's just a more sensible thing to take it out from an industrial process. Got nothing against air capture, but what I would say is that you need to put carbon capture and storage on every industrial process that produces a significant amount of CO2 before you start thinking about capturing CO2 from the air.
So you've obviously written extensively on carbon capture involved in industrial processes, including cement and steel. Could you explain for the listener how carbon capture could be deployed in those industries?
Well, it's basically the same as anything that, as power stations or anything like that. You essentially, on the exhaust of the system, you put a capture unit, you pass the exhaust gases from the process over that capture unit, over a solvent, which is within that capture unit, and then you take the solvent off and heat it up in most cases, and the CO2 comes off as a pure stream. There are a few different ways that you can capture CO2, particularly in industry, to do with different parts of the process where you can actually get at a very high concentration CO2 stream within the process. But most of the systems that people are thinking about are somewhere within the process you pass a stream containing CO2 over a solvent or something like that, and then strip it out and take it off to somewhere else. There's a couple of bits you can do more clever capture of CO2 within, but I mean, you probably don't want me to go into the details of chemical engineering processes right now. So just to say that there's many ways that you can capture the CO2 at the exhaust, and there are some ways of capturing CO2 within the process which occasionally turn out to be more sensible.
And I understand that specifically for cement, there have been a lot of exciting developments in this area recently, including the possibility of carbon being stored within cement itself. Could you talk about that?
Well, there's a lot of people who might suggest that their technology is pretty exciting. I think what you're talking about is carbon cure. So all Portland cement, which is the type of cement that we basically use, 90% of the world's cement is that, will slowly take up CO2 from the atmosphere as it's in situ, right? So over 20 or 30, 40 years. Now, what Carbon Cure do is they put in a little bit of CO2 into their cement mix while they're delivering it to site in their sort of cement truck, those ones that you see going around. And that captures that CO2. Sometimes they do it slightly differently, but that captures that CO2 and also has some benefits in terms of improving how quickly the cement hardens and the total amount of cement that you need to use in a situation because it's slightly harder. So the main saving of CO2 that Carbon Cure makes is by allowing you to use slightly less cement than you would otherwise use. And obviously, if you're not using particular cement because, the cement that they're producing is a bit harder, then you don't have to pay the emissions price for cement you're not using.
So turning to the UK government strategy, as you well know, carbon capture and storage is a central part of the government's net zero strategy, setting an ambition of capturing 20 to 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030. On that basis, the Climate Change Committee has also referred to carbon capture and storage as a necessity, not an option for that transition. Professor Fennell, what do you see as the challenges of scaling carbon capture and storage in the UK?
Right. It's a solved problem in terms of the chemical engineering. The process of capturing CO2 from most industrial plants is quite simple in terms of the chemical engineering. You go and ask an engineering house to design the process. They would then commission the chemical engineering process. It's easily done. The issue is the cost, and any process that you are using to capture CO2 does add cost to your industrial plant. That cost then ends up having to be passed on to the consumer, and the consumers may not like it. There's an issue as well with the potential for goods to be coming from non-regulated markets into regulated markets. So certain places in the world don't have to capture their CO2 or wouldn't have to capture their CO2. And it's unfair for those goods to be directly competing with European and UK goods where CO2 has to be captured because those goods that are coming in will be cheaper than goods that are produced where CO2 has to be captured. So you have to have some sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism to even the playing field between the two regimes.
And are there proposals for such a carbon border adjustment mechanism to be brought in place?
Yep, the EU is writing the legislation at the moment, and the UK is similarly thinking about legislation, because obviously we now need to simply copy the Brussels legislation rather than just writing it into our own rules. Thank you, Brexit.
So on that, the UK government has committed to investing in carbon capture and has pledged to invest £22 billion over the next 25 years, and has promised to create 2 industrial clusters by the mid-2020s and 4 sites by 2030. The first of those clusters is the HyNet Northwest Carbon Capture and Storage Project in the northwest of England and North Wales. Could you please explain to the listener what type of facility is being proposed?
So HyNet is producing hydrogen to sort of move around the country, and it's an industrial decarbonisation cluster rather than a simple individual processes. Now, the point of it being a cluster is actually quite important, because a cluster can capture CO2 much more effectively than single plants, because they can share infrastructure around each other, particularly CO2 transport infrastructure. If you are producing CO2, and if everybody has to take their own pipe and take that out to the location where you're storing the CO2, it starts to become much more expensive. So by sharing the infrastructure between a variety of different locations which produce CO2, you make things cheaper. So one of the things that is there is the Pagewood Cement Works in North Wales, and that will be quite exciting, certainly for me, because I've been working in CO2 capture on cement for a long time, and it'll be exciting to see a cement plant finally get CO2 capture in the UK. So the advantages are that everybody's using a common pipeline, and so that brings the costs down. The disadvantage is you actually also capture some minor species in there as well. So it's not just CO2 that goes into your pipeline. You've got a little bit, if you're producing hydrogen, you'll have a little bit of hydrogen, you'll have a little bit of other species in there. And you have to make sure that they don't interact with each other in the pipe, particularly if you've got one plant doing CO2 capture in one way, one plant doing CO2 capture in a different way. You have to make sure that the minor species from the different plants don't interact to give you issues. But just to be clear, that's something that people have been investigating. It's something that people are hot on making sure is not a problem, and it is well within UK competence in industrial health and safety to manage. But, you know, it is something that you do have to think about.
So the HyNet Northwest cluster proposes for carbon to be transported via offshore pipelines to repurposed platforms in the Liverpool Bay before that CO2 is injected into a reservoir below the seabed. As you may know, a legal challenge was recently brought in August to the Secretary of State's decision to grant consent for the HyNet development. That challenge was refused permission on the 15th of October 2025. But I was hoping, Professor Fennell, that you could answer a short question in relation to one of the grounds of challenge, which focused on the possibility of major accidents and disasters at carbon capture plants. What are the risks in relation to carbon capture and storage?
The risks are pretty much the same risks that we have for industrial transport of a liquid or a supercritical fluid anywhere in the world. I mean, there's 5,000 kilometers of CO2 pipelines in West Texas, and you know they've been operating safely for many years. There are a number of CO2 capture pilots and demonstrations and actual, industrial plants operating all around the world. The risks are similar to the risks that one has for any large-scale chemical plant. And we have a long and storied history of chemical plants and processes in the UK, which we've been operating perfectly safely for many years. The thought that maybe this is some sort of new, more dangerous type of plant is, frankly, basically ridiculous. I mean, we have operated similar processes safely for many years. Now, I'm not going to say that the risk is zero. Obviously, if you are operating chemical plants, processes with pipelines at 100 bar, 100 atmospheres, there is some hazard associated with that. But we work to minimize the hazards, and we have safety regimes that mean that if you were to operate in an unsafe way, you'd be getting a visit from policeman Plod and perhaps going to jail. So we operate chemical plants with much more hazardous things than CO2 quite happily in the UK at the moment. And we pipeline transport much more dangerous stuff around without even anyone really thinking about it. I mean, certainly, if I was going to think of a thing that I would not want to design a system to pipeline into people's houses, it would be natural gas, methane. It's explosive, it's dangerous, and fundamentally CO2 is much less hazardous than natural gas. And we pipeline that around in massive pipelines all around the country.
That's really interesting. And obviously one of the greatest concerns with methane is methane leaks. Is there any risk with storing carbon in reservoirs or under the seabed of leaks or basically that carbon being released? What is the risk of that?
I'm going to caveat this with I'm not a geologist, but the risk is, I have been told by my geologist friends, that the risk is almost negligible. If you were to think about it this way, it might assuage issues. We drill down and produce natural gas and oil from various places, kilometers underneath even the water. And we have done that safely for many years. It is a thing that one has to do carefully and one has to do sensibly. And you have to apply all the legislation and make sure that people are complying with the legislation. But there is no intrinsic reason why it should be a risky endeavor. The risks of it leaking to begin with are very, very small, and it is not that dangerous if it were to leak.
And so one of the other objections to carbon capture and storage is specifically in relation to its use for power generation as proposed at HyNet. There is concern that carbon capture facilitates further fossil fuel use in the absence of a transition to green energy. What do you see as the role of carbon capture in the energy transition?
Well, I see it as a transitional technology to allow us to continue to have reasonably priced electricity whilst we're making the transition away from fossil fuels and towards greener technologies. However, even when we have a fully decarbonised electricity grid, or we have an electricity grid that is as decarbonised as possible, there will still be a role for carbon capture and storage on industrial processes where the CO2 is being produced intrinsically as part of the industrial process. And there will still be a role for carbon capture and storage in power to allow for power to be produced when there is a big lull, when the wind is not blowing and the sun's not shining, you need to have something that you can use to back up the renewables. And battery storage can't last for long enough. So essentially what I would say, and the case I always make, is that carbon capture and storage isn't an alternative to renewables. It's a complementary technology to renewables, and it helps the rollout of renewables to be as cheap as possible.
So one of the other concerns in relation to carbon capture is alleged greenwashing. So basically, there's concerns, at least in relation to how carbon capture is sometimes reported in the media, that companies treat it as basically being a silver bullet or a get-out-of-jail-free card. As a scientist working in the area, how can we combat overstated claims on carbon capture and storage?
Well, I think by doing careful and boring analysis of the exact limits to how much carbon capture and storage can be deployed, and working with industries to make sure that they are not making claims that they can't stand up. I would be the first person to argue against a company that I thought was doing greenwashing with its carbon capture pledges. I do argue against some of the companies that are, for example, suggesting that they can do extremely cheap capture of CO2 from the air. But basically, what you need to do is careful, methodical analysis and examine how much these processes actually can take out from wherever they're going to do it, how much that will cost, and on the other side of the ledger, how many jobs they will enable, how much CO2 will be prevented from going into the atmosphere, etc. And basically look at the net benefits. And if there is a net benefit, then go ahead. And if there's not a net benefit, then don't go ahead. But you do have to think about the societal cost of the CO2, not just the cost of capturing it. So, I don't know what the societal cost of CO2 is per ton at the moment, but I'd guess somewhere around $200 to $300 per ton. And you can do an awful lot of CO2 capture before you get anywhere near that cost in terms of going up from the cheapest sources of CO2 to the most expensive sources of CO2.
Final question, Professor Fennell. What do you see as the greatest legal or non-legal barrier to addressing climate change?
In the context of CCS, I would say it is the cost. In terms of legally, there's a responsibility for the government to spend taxpayers' money as effectively as possible. In fact, this touches on what we've just been discussing about greenwashing, etc. And again, it comes down to doing the hard analysis and making sure that when CO2 capture processes are being proposed, they are spending taxpayers' money in a wise manner. Otherwise, they will face legal challenges. The actual process of capturing CO2 is a process that we have been doing for nearly 100 years. So industrially, and in terms of the chemical engineering, total non-issue, but there will be challenges on the grounds of cost. And that's perfectly sensible. I mean, where people should be accountable for what they're doing, but the challenges should come based on actual scientific and engineering analysis, not just not wanting to do something because they don't like fossil fuels or they don't think that it's a good idea. It's basically cost.
Thank you so much, Professor Fennell, for joining us today, and thank you all for listening.